The rain hadn't touched the pavement in weeks, but that morning, the sky above Fairview was a mass of bruised clouds, pregnant with something heavier than water, like the city itself was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the gleaming glass towers and crumbling red brick buildings, past the metal fences that whispered of gentrification, a storm was circling that no weather forecast could predict. On the corner of 7th and Holloway, beneath a flickering street lamp that buzzed like a dying hornet, she sat, still, silent, and out of place, or so it seemed to anyone passing by. Her name was Mabel Carter, though most who saw her only registered old and black before averting their eyes and quickening their pace. She didn't ask for change. She didn't speak. She just watched. Watched like someone who'd seen this city rise, fall, and rise again on promises it never kept. Across town, Officer Jim Wilson sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, knuckles clenched around the steering wheel, eyes scanning the streets like a predator too long without a hunt. He was the kind of cop who didn't just patrol, he claimed. He claimed sidewalks, stairs, and silence. And God help anyone who stood too long in his dominion. And today, his gaze locked onto Mabel. To him, she was nothing but a shadow on a clean wall, a mark to be erased. What he didn't know was that the storm wasn't in the sky above them. It was in that woman's blood, in her memory, in her bones. She was the storm, and he had just decided to walk into the center of it. Mabel Carter had walked the streets of Fairview longer than most of its mayors had held office, longer than some of its buildings had even existed. Yet to the people who passed her every day, she was just another relic left to decay with the broken benches and cracked sidewalks of a neighborhood they were trying to erase. Once, her name echoed in hushed tones through the chambers of City Hall. Investors, developers, school officials, even judges had stood in line to shake her hand when her wealth quietly stitched holes in the city's crumbling infrastructure. But Mabel never asked for recognition. She didn't need her name on plaques or her face in newspapers. She worked in silence, behind doors where decisions were made, building futures for others while her own story faded into shadow. Now, in her old age, her influence hidden behind layers of indifference, she sat on that same corner where her first donation check had saved a community center from demolition. But none of that mattered to Officer Wilson. When he stepped out of his cruiser, the sound of his boots against the wet pavement was like a war drum. "Move along," he snapped, his voice dry and sharp. Mabel looked up, her eyes steady, tired but unbroken. "Just resting my legs," she said quietly. "I didn't ask for a reason," he replied, stepping closer, the weight of his badge heavy in his voice. "You people always got a story, don't you?" His tone dripped with a practiced disdain, the kind of venom that doesn't explode but seeps, slow and suffocating. She didn't respond, didn't flinch, and that silence only made him angrier. "Loitering," he declared like it was a verdict. "You're under arrest." He said it loud enough for the nearby cafe goers to hear, and as heads turned behind windows and phones slipped from pockets to record, Mabel was lifted from her seat like a piece of garbage being cleared from a doorstep. The cuffs bit into her wrists with deliberate pressure, and Wilson leaned in close as he guided her toward the cruiser. "Bet no one's ever talked to you like this before, huh?" he muttered with a smirk, mistaking her composure for submission. But Mabel wasn't silent because she was afraid. She was silent because she had already decided. This city was about to remember exactly who she was, and the storm inside her had only just begun to stir. Officer Jim Wilson had been wearing the badge for over a decade, but what he truly wore was something heavier, entitlement stitched from years of unchecked power and silent approval. In Fairview's police precinct, Wilson wasn't just another cop. He was the one who knew how to handle them, the one they called when they wanted the streets to look cleaner, whiter, quieter. He walked like he owned more than a gun and a badge. He moved like he owned the right to decide who belonged in the city and who didn't. So when he pushed Mabel Carter into the backseat of his cruiser, he didn't see a woman with history, dignity, or legacy. He saw what he wanted to see. A black woman sitting where she didn't belong. "Should have stayed invisible," he said as he slammed the door, the sound echoing like a final insult. The ride to the station was slow, deliberate. He made sure to take the long way through downtown, past cafes where white professionals sipped lattes and glanced up from their screens at the sight of a handcuffed elderly woman in the back of a patrol car. Some shook their heads in disapproval, not at the cop, but at her, another reminder that the city still had stains. Inside the cruiser, Mabel sat like stone, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't plead, didn't ask questions. That silence unnerved him more than shouting ever could. "You people never learn," he said over his shoulder. "Act like the rules don't apply. Sit around like the world owes you something. Not anymore. Not while I'm in uniform." At the precinct, no one questioned the arrest. Mabel was processed like a common criminal, her mugshot taken without ceremony, her name written down like it meant nothing. A young officer asked her age and blinked when she answered. 83. He paused, hesitated for just a second, but Wilson stepped in. "Doesn't matter. If she's old enough to sit where she's not supposed to, she's old enough to know better." The young officer looked away. No one offered her a chair. No one asked why she was really there. And Wilson, he watched her with a smirk, pleased with the scene he'd orchestrated. "You'll be out soon," he sneered. "Back to your little corner. Or maybe not. Maybe this time we'll make sure you don't come back." He didn't see the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. He didn't feel the storm building behind those calm eyes. Because to Wilson, Mabel Carter was already erased. But what he failed to understand, what everyone in that room failed to see, was that you can't erase a name written into the foundation of the very city you serve. And the city was about to remember. Let's take a short pause in the story. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and if anything like this has ever happened in your life or community. Stories like this are more than fiction. They reflect something deeper. If you're drawn in, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Now, we continue. The corner of 7th and Holloway was quiet now, but the memory of what had happened just hours earlier still lingered like smoke after a fire. The stain where Mabel Carter once sat hadn't been scrubbed away, though the city would soon try. A fresh patrol car idled nearby, a subtle warning to anyone else thinking they could just linger without purpose. But in truth, Mabel hadn't just been removed, she'd been erased. That's how it always started, not with shouting or sirens, but with silence so thick it smothered. Back at the precinct, Officer Wilson leaned against the wall, sipping cheap coffee and soaking in the approving glances from a few of his colleagues. "Did us all a favor," one of them muttered. "She's been parked there for years like she owns the place." Wilson chuckled. "Not anymore. One less problem." And just like that, they all moved on. White uniforms in white halls, pretending that what had happened was just another tick on the day's report. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Mabel sat alone. No phone call, no explanation, just cold metal and fluorescent lights. She wasn't shackled, but the air itself pressed against her like chains. Another officer, young, unsure, walked past her without a glance. To him, she was just another face in the system. No one questioned what an 83-year-old woman was doing behind bars for loitering. No one asked why there were no priors, no confrontation, no resistance. But it wasn't about the law. It was never about the law. It was about visibility, who was allowed to be seen, and who was meant to disappear. Mabel Carter, despite everything she'd done for this city, was being taught a lesson. Stay small, stay quiet, and don't forget where you came from. They wanted her to feel less than human. That's how systems like this keep turning, by grinding down dignity, one soul at a time. And yet, even now, even surrounded by concrete and contempt, Mabel's eyes didn't waver, because the city might have forgotten her name, but she hadn't. And soon, neither would they. The clock on the wall of the holding cell ticked monotonously, its hands moving in slow defiance of the chaos that roiled just outside. Mabel sat against the cold metal wall, her back straight despite the discomfort, eyes focused on a point beyond the bars. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet knowing that the storm was coming. The city had always been like this, silent when it needed to be, and loud when it could afford to pretend everything was fine. But this wasn't about Fairview's decay or its desperate attempts to clean itself up. This was about something deeper, something buried so far beneath the surface that no one ever noticed it until it exploded. and Mabel had been a part of that foundation. She had been the one who had sewn together the threads of the city's very fabric. She had built schools, funded hospitals, supported local businesses when no one else would. And now, she was being treated like a criminal simply for sitting in a spot she'd been allowed to sit for years. The irony wasn't lost on her. The irony was the one thing that kept her from falling apart in the silence of the cell. Outside, the streets of Fairview continued to hum with the usual energy. People bustled, pretending to live their lives in the shadow of the buildings that stretched high above them, oblivious to the fact that a woman who had kept their city running for decades was now locked away like any common criminal. Mabel wasn't the only one who had seen it. Others had watched the streets become more polished, more presentable as the years went on. But it was all a facade. Beneath that polished surface lay the rot of inequality, of history erased, of the people who built this place being swept under the rug. The irony was also in the fact that Mabel, despite her contributions, wasn't even on the list of names that people remembered when they thought of Fairview's rise. No one talked about the woman who made sure people in the poorest neighborhoods had jobs, who gave food to families who couldn't afford it, who supported the arts and culture in a city that seemed to have forgotten them. No, people remembered the mayors, the businessmen, the so-called philanthropists who took credit for everything they hadn't actually done. They remembered the men who wore suits, the ones who grinned on television screens and made promises that never came to fruition. But Mabel had never cared for recognition. That wasn't why she did what she did. She did it because, despite everything, she still believed in the potential of this city. But now she was a nobody, just another black woman caught in the system, a system that had no place for someone like her. Back at the station, Officer Wilson felt the weight of the arrest settling in, though he would never admit it. He wasn't questioning his actions. No, not at all. But there was something about this case, something about Mabel, that gnawed at him. He had arrested people before. Hell, he had arrested people every day. But this wasn't the same. Maybe it was her age, her composure, the way she didn't beg or cry. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, as if she knew something he didn't. Something about the city that he couldn't see. He brushed the thought away as he sat in the break room, cleaning his weapon, trying to ignore the discomfort that was creeping into his chest. He had done the right thing. She was a nuisance, just like the others. It didn't matter what she had done for the city. It didn't matter how long she had been around. She had no right to sit there, no right to take up space. He had to remind himself that it was just another job, just another day. But it wasn't just another job. And he knew it. Deep down, he knew it. As he sipped his coffee, the phone rang. A quiet, sharp ring that cut through the room like a knife. He didn't want to pick it up. He didn't want to hear the words that were coming. But he had no choice. The precinct was a machine, and he was a cog in that machine. He answered. "Wilson, what the hell did you do?" The voice on the other end was sharp, unmistakable. It was the mayor's office. He sat up straight, immediately regretting the decision to answer. "What do you mean, sir? Do you have any idea who that woman is?" the voice demanded. He felt his stomach churn. "I know exactly who she is. Just another loiterer. Another nuisance." "Wilson, you don't get it, do you?" The voice on the other end was colder now, tinged with disbelief. "That woman, Mabel Carter, she's the reason half this city even exists. You have no idea what you've done." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of something Wilson couldn't quite grasp. He stared at the wall, unable to say anything. Mabel Carter, the same woman who had sat on that corner for years, ignored by the very people she had helped. It didn't make sense. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. She was just sitting there. She wasn't doing anything." "Jesus Christ, Wilson, do you even know how much money she's poured into this city? How many projects she's funded? How many people she's kept alive?" The voice on the other end was rising now, almost frantic. "That woman is a goddamn legend in this town, and you just arrested her. You don't even know who you're dealing with." Wilson's mind raced. The name didn't register. He had never heard of her before. Why would he? She was just some old woman sitting on a corner. But as the words sank in, a sense of dread began to settle in his chest. He had made a mistake. A mistake so big it could unravel everything. The voice on the other end continued. You get her out of there right now. I don't care how. You release her and you apologize. You fix this or your career in this town is over. The phone call ended abruptly, leaving Wilson in stunned silence. He sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The calm, collected image he had tried to maintain was shattering. The realization was dawning on him. He had just humiliated a woman who had kept this city alive for decades. And now, he had no idea how to fix it. In the holding cell, Mabel didn't know what was happening outside. She didn't know that the walls of the city were beginning to shake, that her name was being whispered in the mayor's office, in the circles of power she had long ago distanced herself from. All she knew was that the storm inside her had only grown stronger. Mabel wasn't the victim. No, she never had been. The world had always been the one that needed saving, not her. And now, they had made their mistake. They had underestimated her. And when you underestimate someone like Mabel Carter, you open the door to a reckoning you can't control. The storm was coming, and Fairview had no idea what was about to hit it. The fluorescent lights buzzed above Mabel as she sat in the holding cell, their sickly white glow casting shadows across her tired face. Her hands, though weathered by time and work, remained steady, unshaken, the steel cuffs biting into her wrists with every shift of her weight. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the lights, the occasional shuffle of a guard's boots, and the muffled voices from the halls of the precinct. Mabel didn't speak. She had no need to. Words had never been the weapon she wielded best. For years, she had been the quiet force behind the scenes, directing, guiding, building, without ever asking for the recognition she deserved. But now, she was being forced into the spotlight, whether she liked it or not. And despite the chains that bound her, Mabel understood one undeniable truth. The city wasn't ready for what was coming. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, steady and relentless. It hammered the windows of the precinct, an ominous reminder that nature itself had no tolerance for injustice. The streets of Fairview, slick with rainwater, reflected the blurred lights of passing cars. But nothing could wash away the ugliness that had already settled into the city's bones. The arrest of Mabel Carter, one of the oldest residents in Fairview, a woman who had invested more into the city's future than any politician or businessman, was a stain that would never be scrubbed clean. Officer Jim Wilson, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface, paced back and forth in the precinct's break room, his mind spinning. The phone call from the mayor's office had left him rattled, unsure of how to proceed. For years, he had patrolled the streets with a simple mantra: control the undesirables, keep the streets clean, and make sure the right people stayed in charge. People like Mabel, people who didn't fit into his narrow vision of who belonged and who didn't, were nothing more than obstacles. But now he was realizing that he had underestimated her in a way he could never have anticipated. What was she? A philanthropist? A queen in disguise? The woman he had just arrested had been the quiet backbone of the city. And yet, despite her power, despite her history, he had treated her like a criminal. He couldn't take back what he had done, couldn't erase the image of her face, her calm, unyielding face, as he slapped the cuffs on her. That image lingered, gnawing at him, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about this city. The sound of his boots echoed as he walked down the sterile corridor of the precinct, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him with each step. He couldn't shake the thought that he had made a mistake that would cost him more than just his career. He had disrespected someone who had shaped the very city he served. He had been so quick to judge her, so quick to assume that someone like Mabel, someone who didn't fit the mold of power he understood, had no place in his world. But now, the city was shifting beneath him, and he could feel it. It wasn't just Mabel Carter that was being threatened. It was the entire foundation of everything he had ever believed about Fairview. The door to Mabel's cell opened, and Officer Wilson stepped inside. His hands were shaking, just slightly, but it was enough for Mabel to notice. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her calm demeanor was like a slap in the face to him, a reminder that her strength wasn't measured by what he could see. It was something deeper, something that had been forged over decades of surviving in a world that never cared about people like her. "You're free to go," he said, his voice betraying a hint of something unfamiliar. Guilt, maybe, or fear. He didn't know how to act now, how to face her after everything he had done. But he had no choice. The mayor had spoken. The press had started sniffing around. The backlash would be catastrophic if Mabel wasn't released, if the city didn't make a public apology. Mabel didn't respond. She remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had known this moment was coming. She had known that, eventually, the powers that be would realize their mistake and try to cover it up. But it didn't matter. Nothing they did now could erase the truth of what had happened. Mabel wasn't a symbol of victimhood. She wasn't someone to be pitied. She was a force in her own right, a woman who had carved out a place for herself in a world that had tried to silence her at every turn. And now, she was about to remind everyone exactly why they should have feared her. "You don't get it, do you?" Mabel's voice was low, steady. She looked up at him for the first time, her gaze cutting through him like a blade. "You think letting me go is enough? You think that this little slip-up is going to fix everything? You're wrong." Wilson froze, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. His mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mabel stood slowly, the chains around her wrists clinking as she moved. She was tall for her age, her posture strong, as if the years hadn't done much to diminish her presence. She stepped toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. "You think this is just about me? About one mistake? This city has been built on mistakes, Jim. Your mistake. My mistake. The mistakes of everyone who's ever been shoved to the side and forgotten. But that's where you're wrong. You've all underestimated me. You've underestimated people like me, who have been quietly holding this city together for years. You think this is just an inconvenience, a minor problem to be swept under the rug. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither are the people who helped build this place." Wilson swallowed hard, his stomach sinking as he realized the truth of what she was saying. Mabel had been a part of the fabric of this city for so long, a part of its beating heart. He had seen her as just another piece of the background, another face in the crowd. But now, he was starting to understand the depth of her influence, the power she had, and how it had been concealed beneath the surface. She wasn't just an old woman on a corner. She was the reason the corner existed in the first place. She was the reason the city still stood, and he had been blind to it. "I'm sorry," Wilson muttered, though he knew the words were hollow. The apology didn't even begin to cover the magnitude of his actions. He had done far more than arrest her. He had disrespected a legacy, an entire history of people who had worked tirelessly to make this city what it was. And now he was just another cog in the machine that had tried to bury that history. Mabel stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Jim. Sorry doesn't bring back the years of hard work that have been erased. Sorry doesn't bring back the lives that have been crushed under the weight of your ignorance. You'll never understand because you've never had to fight for something you built with your own hands. But you will remember me. You will remember this. And so will everyone else who's been overlooked, pushed aside, or silenced." The weight of her words hit him harder than any blow he had ever received. For the first time in his career, Officer Wilson was forced to confront the reality that he wasn't the one in control. Mabel wasn't the criminal here. He was. He was the one who had been blind to the history, blind to the power that lay in the shadows. And now, it was too late to take it all back. Mabel turned her back to him, her figure silhouetted against the harsh lights of the precinct. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence, her silence, spoke louder than any words could ever do. The storm had already arrived, and it would take more than apologies to weather it. Wilson stood there, motionless, his mind reeling from the realization that he had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The world was about to change, and Fairview was going to remember the name of Mabel Carter. The rain had stopped, but the air in Fairview still held the tension of an impending storm. The city, usually a place of hurried movements and impersonal encounters, seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for something. waiting for the truth to surface, or for the inevitable reckoning that was about to unfold. Mabel Carter had been released from the precinct, but the ordeal was far from over. The apology, though delivered by the mayor's office in a public statement, felt hollow, like a band-aid hastily slapped onto a gaping wound. The media had picked up the story, and the city was buzzing with the details of the arrest. The elderly black woman who had been detained for simply sitting on a corner she had sat on for years, a corner she had helped to build. But this wasn't just about one woman's humiliation. It was about a system that had been designed to silence and erase the contributions of people like her, the people who had built the very city that now turned its back on them. For Mabel, the release from the precinct was not a victory. It was merely the beginning of something much larger. The storm inside her had not subsided. It had only grown stronger, more focused. Mabel was not going to fade quietly into the background again. This was not just about her own story. This was about all the people who had been forgotten by the city, all the people whose hard work and sacrifices had gone unrecognized for decades. And now, Mabel was going to make sure they were seen and heard. She stood in the middle of her small apartment, looking out the window at the skyline of Fairview. The city's silhouette loomed in the distance, its gleaming towers standing tall and proud. Yet Mabel knew better than anyone that the shining surface of the city hid the decay beneath. She could see the cracks in the pavement, the abandoned homes, the businesses that had once thrived but were now fading into the background, casualties of gentrification and neglect. The city had promised change, but it had only delivered more of the same. The rich got richer, the powerful stayed powerful, and the rest were left to pick up the pieces. Mabel turned away from the window and walked to her desk, where a stack of papers lay. Documents that detailed everything she had done for this city. Her investments, her donations, her support for local schools and hospitals. She had funded projects that had kept this city alive, and yet no one ever knew her name. She had never cared about recognition. She had done it because she believed in the city, in its potential to be better. But now, as she sat there in the dim light of her apartment, the weight of it all hit her. The city had turned its back on her, and it was time to make them see. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she picked it up anyway. Mabel Carter. The voice on the other end was smooth, calculating. Yes, Mabel replied, her voice steady, but her mind already racing. I've been following your case, the voice continued. I think we can help each other. Mabel's eyes narrowed. She had heard of people like this. Those who tried to capitalize on moments of vulnerability. Those who saw opportunity in others' misfortune. Who is this? She asked, suspicion rising. The voice chuckled, a sound that felt more like a smirk. Let's just say I represent certain interests in the city. People who have been following your situation closely. We can offer you help, support, resources, visibility. You don't have to keep fighting this alone. Mabel stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. What's the catch? She asked, her voice calm but sharp. The voice paused for a moment before responding. The catch is that you'll have to play by their rules. You'll get the spotlight, but you'll have to share it with others who are less concerned with your legacy. People who know how to get things done. Mabel's mind raced. She knew exactly who these people were. Powerful men and women who had only ever cared about one thing, control. They didn't care about her or the city. They only cared about keeping things the way they were, where they held the reins, and everyone else was just along for the ride. No, Mabel said firmly, cutting him off. I don't need your help, and I won't let you turn this into a circus. The voice on the other end of the line was silent for a long moment before speaking again, this time with a note of coldness. You'll regret this, Mabel. You're playing a dangerous game, and it's not one you can win alone. The line went dead, and Mabel hung up the phone, the echo of the conversation still lingering in the room. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted to control the narrative, to take her story and twist it into something they could use for their own gain. But Mabel wasn't going to play their game. She was going to write her own story. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and media appearances. Mabel had never been one to seek the spotlight, but now it seemed as though the city was finally waking up to her. Her arrest had become a symbol of the larger issues in Fairview: the systemic racism, the erasure of black history, and the exploitation of the city's most vulnerable citizens. The media outlets that had once ignored her now clambered to get her on their platforms, eager to hear her story, eager to paint her as the victim of an unjust system. But Mabel was careful. She didn't let them define her. She didn't let them make her into a martyr or a symbol. She was more than that. She was a force. And she was going to use the platform she had been given to expose the truth about Fairview, to expose the ugly reality that no one wanted to see. In the midst of the media frenzy, Mabel made a decision. She reached out to the people who had once been her allies, the ones she had helped build this city with. They were still there, though they had been pushed to the margins, ignored and forgotten. But they had never disappeared. They had only been waiting for the right moment. The meeting took place in a small, run-down building on the outskirts of town. The room was dimly lit, the walls covered in peeling paint, but the people inside were the ones who had shaped the city before it became a glittering facade. They were the teachers, the activists, the workers who had kept Fairview alive long before it had become a playground for the wealthy. Mabel stood at the front of the room, her voice steady as she addressed the group. "It's time," she said. "It's time we take back what's ours. It's time we show them that they can't erase us. They can't erase our contributions, our history. They can't erase who we are." The room was silent for a moment before one of the men stood up. "How do we do it?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We start by making them see us," Mabel replied. "We make them understand that we're not going to be quiet anymore. We demand our place in this city, in its history. We build a movement that can't be ignored." And just like that, a plan began to take shape. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be messy, and there would be resistance, so much resistance. But Mabel Carter was done being invisible. She had spent too many years in the shadows, too many years helping others without ever asking for anything in return. But now, the storm was no longer something that was coming. It was here, and Mabel was ready. Fairview wasn't ready for what was coming, but Mabel Carter was going to make sure they couldn't ignore her any longer. The revolution had begun. The nights in Fairview had never been quiet, but lately, the hum of the city had become a constant undertone of tension, like the buzz of a faulty light bulb, a reminder that things weren't as they seemed. Mabel Carter knew it. She had always known it. The people who built this city, people like her, had been silent too long. But silence had its cost, and the price of keeping quiet was too high to ignore any longer. Her movement was gaining momentum now. It was spreading, slowly but surely, through the forgotten neighborhoods, through the communities that had been trampled underfoot for decades. Mabel had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of defiance, of strength in the face of erasure. She had found allies, people who understood the weight of history and the power of taking it back. They were the teachers, the construction workers, the mothers who had raised their children in the cracks of a broken system. They were the people who had been ignored for so long, and they were ready to fight for what had always been theirs. The media, of course, had begun to latch onto Mabel's story, but not in the way she had hoped. They saw her as a figure to be paraded, a symbol of the downtrodden black community, an easy story of oppression that they could package and sell. They wanted her to become a talking point, a talking head for a movement they didn't understand. They saw her face, but they didn't see the fire behind her eyes. They didn't understand the storm she had become. Mabel's meetings had grown larger, more organized. She was no longer just the old woman who had been arrested for loitering. Now, she was the face of a rebellion that was bubbling up from the streets of Fairview. She was the one who could speak truth to power. And for the first time in a long time, people were actually listening. But with that attention came new dangers. The city, the people in power, were beginning to feel threatened. They had worked so hard to keep the narrative under control, to suppress the voices of those who didn't fit into their neatly curated world. They had erased Mabel's name from the history books, had written over her contributions with the stories of men in suits who had done nothing to build the city they now claimed ownership of. It was time for Mabel to take it all back, but the cost of visibility was steep, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. There were whispers now, rumors circulating through the streets. People who once worked with her, people who had long depended on her support, were suddenly turning away. Not everyone was ready for the truth Mabel was speaking. The system she was up against was ruthless, and it had always been this way. It had been built on the backs of people like her, but it had never been built for them. One evening, Mabel stood on the balcony of her apartment, overlooking the city she had helped to shape. The lights of the skyline flickered in the distance, almost as if the city itself were alive, struggling to maintain the illusion of progress. Below her, the streets bustled with activity, but Mabel could see the cracks in the facade. The city was trying to forget its past, her past, and the people who had made it what it was. But the cracks were widening. And as the days passed, Mabel began to realize something. The city wasn't just ignoring her legacy, it was trying to erase it. She wasn't just a symbol of resistance anymore, she was a threat. The first real attack came without warning. It was a quiet morning when the city's largest news outlet released a scathing article, an exposé that attempted to tear Mabel's reputation to shreds. The headline screamed, "The truth about Mabel Carter, a legacy built on lies." It was the kind of story that could destroy everything. They claimed that Mabel's financial support for local businesses had been self-serving, that her investments had been a way to secure her own influence, that she had only ever helped others to benefit herself. They twisted her legacy into a web of deceit, trying to paint her as a puppet master, a woman who had controlled the strings of the city for her own gain. Mabel read the article, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the words. She had known this was coming. She had known that once she started fighting back, the powers that be would retaliate, would do everything in their power to discredit her. But this was different. They weren't just attacking her. They were attacking the very foundation of the city, the truth of everything she had built. They were trying to rewrite history. But what they didn't understand was that Mabel had lived through worse. She had fought battles far more dangerous than any smear campaign the media could throw at her. She had seen the city's power brokers, the men in suits and ties, use their wealth to control everything around them. She had seen the way they used racism, classism, and division to keep the people in line. Mabel wasn't going to let them do it anymore. She knew she had to respond, but she wasn't going to do it alone. The community she had built, the movement she had sparked, had been growing stronger by the day. And now, it was time to bring it all together. A week later, in a small rundown theatre on the edge of Fairview, Mabel stood in front of a crowd that had gathered to hear her speak. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: activists, workers, teachers, families who had been ignored for so long. They had come to hear Mabel's truth, to hear the story that had been buried beneath years of lies. The room was tense. The air crackled with anticipation. Mabel took the stage, her presence commanding the room. She wasn't the frail, quiet woman who had been arrested months ago. She was a force now, a woman who had been pushed too far, who had been underestimated for too long. "I'm not here to beg for your forgiveness," she began, her voice steady, resonant. "I'm not here to play the role that they've written for me. I'm here to speak the truth they've been trying to bury for decades." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "They want to erase us. They want to pretend that we didn't build this city, that we didn't fight for it, that we didn't make it what it is today. But they're wrong, and I'm not going to let them get away with it any longer." The crowd erupted into applause. It was loud, passionate, and it sent a wave of energy through Mabel. She could feel the power of the people behind her. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was their fight. "You see," she continued, "they want to rewrite history. They want to tell you that people like me, people like us, are just bystanders in our own story, that we didn't build this city, that we didn't fight for our right to be seen. But I'm telling you right now, they're wrong. We built this. We made this city what it is, and they've been trying to take it from us ever since." Mabel's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words flowing out of her with a force that seemed to echo through the walls of the theatre. "They want us to believe that we're invisible. They want us to believe that our contributions don't matter, that our lives don't matter. But they're wrong. They are so wrong. And it's time we show them just how wrong they are. The room was alive now, the energy palpable. People were standing, cheering, ready to take action. Mabel knew that the time for talking was over. Now, it was time for the city to see the power of its people, the power of the ones it had tried to forget. She finished her speech, the crowd still roaring in approval. Mabel stepped down from the stage, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The city was no longer just a place. It was a battleground, and she had become its warrior. The war for Fairview had only just begun, and Mabel Carter, the woman they had tried to erase, was leading it. The following days in Fairview were unlike any that had come before. The air seemed thicker, charged with the electricity of an impending change. The people were talking about Mabel Carter, about the speech she had given in that small theatre, about the truth that had been buried for so long and was now rising to the surface, like the tide at its peak. Mabel had become a symbol, but not in the way the media had expected. They had tried to portray her as just another black woman, another casualty of a broken system. They wanted to paint her as the victim, the elderly woman who had been wronged, arrested for loitering on a street corner she had sat on for years. But Mabel wasn't the victim. She had never been the victim. She was a force of nature, and she had shown the city just how much power a single individual could wield when they refused to be silenced. The press had scrambled to cover her story, but they quickly realized that she wasn't going to be the figure they could control. They couldn't brand her as a tragic symbol for a moment of pity. Mabel was no longer just an old woman in the background. She was the one telling the story now, and she was pulling the strings. The city was on edge. The local government, the corporations, and the wealthy elite who had long enjoyed the fruits of Fairview's inequality were beginning to feel threatened. They had done everything they could to keep the narrative under their control, to suppress the voices of those who built this place. The workers, the families, the black communities who had kept the city running, while the powerful took credit for the labor of the many. But now the power dynamic was shifting, and they weren't sure how to handle it. Mabel knew what was coming. She could feel it. When the system feels threatened, it fights back, brutally. She had spent decades watching the elite of the city, those in power, those who had pushed the marginalized and the poor to the edges, turn every argument into a war. They played the game of politics and power with ease, and they did it with no conscience. But Mabel had been around long enough to know that she didn't need to play by their rules. She had her own, and now she was about to show them how far she was willing to go to take back what was hers. But Mabel also knew something else. She was going to need help. This wouldn't be a battle she could fight alone, not with the odds stacked so high against her. She had already seen the cracks in the armor of the city's elite, but cracks could only be exploited if there were enough people ready to push through them. One evening, as she walked the streets near her old neighborhood, Mabel stopped by the community center she had helped fund years ago. It had been a lifeline for so many people, especially the youth, who had found refuge in its walls. Now, as Mabel walked through the doors, she saw the same faces, older, wearier, but still there, still fighting. She had supported them, not because she wanted recognition, but because she understood the weight of a community's survival. The center had been a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. It was a symbol of resilience, but it had also been a battleground, a place where the city's most vulnerable fought for their right to be seen. Mabel stepped to the front of the room, where a small group of activists, community leaders, and old friends were gathered. They looked up at her with a mixture of awe and determination. They had all heard her speech, and they knew what was at stake, but they also knew the power Mabel had unleashed. "I don't need to tell you what's at stake here," Mabel began, her voice steady but fierce. "You've all seen it. You've felt it. The city wants us to be invisible, to stay in the shadows where we can't threaten their comfortable little world. But we've been in the shadows long enough. It's time to step into the light." The room was silent for a moment. They knew what this meant. They knew it wasn't just about taking back their streets or fighting for their neighborhoods. It was about something bigger. It was about taking on a system that had been designed to break them down, to erase their contributions, and to keep them in their place. "We've spent too long building this city, and we're not going to let them take it from us," Mabel continued. "They've used racism, They've used poverty. They've used division to keep us in check. But we've had enough. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who's been pushed to the side, forgotten, erased. This is about the people who've built the very foundation of this city. And it's time we take back what's ours. The group began to murmur, their voices rising in agreement. They had heard this before, but it had never felt more urgent than it did now. Mabel's words weren't just a rallying cry. They were a call to action. Over the next several weeks, Mabel and her allies began to organize. They didn't just protest in the streets, they infiltrated the city's power structures, worked their way into the local media, and started spreading the word about the true history of Fairview. They told the stories of the people who had been erased from the city's narrative. Stories of black families who had built the first schools, of immigrants who had worked the docks and the factories, of women who had kept the city's economy running. While the men in charge took the credit, the backlash came quickly, and it came hard. The city's elite didn't take kindly to having their dirty secrets exposed. They didn't like the idea of their carefully constructed narrative being torn down. Mabel began to receive threats, anonymous calls, letters, even people showing up at her door trying to intimidate her. But she wasn't afraid. She had been through worse, and she knew that fear was what kept people like her in their place. She wasn't going to be silenced. But it wasn't just Mabel who was being attacked. The people who stood with her, the ones who had supported her in the shadows, began to feel the full force of the city's wrath. Activists were arrested. Businesses that supported Mabel's movement were targeted, and the media began to smear anyone who spoke out against the status quo. The elites had made it clear they would do anything to keep their power. It wasn't just the media that turned against her. Local law enforcement, many of whom had once turned a blind eye to the city's systemic issues, were now being used as pawns in a larger game of control. Officer Jim Wilson, who had once arrested Mabel, found himself at the heart of the city's effort to suppress the growing rebellion. He was called in by the mayor's office, told to handle the situation and to make sure that the people pushing back didn't gain any ground. But Wilson, despite his past decisions, began to question his role in this narrative. He had arrested Mabel because he had believed the lies, because he had been blinded by the power he had been given. But now he saw the cracks in the system, and he didn't like what he saw. As the pressure mounted, Mabel knew that the final confrontation was coming. The city's elite were pulling out all the stops to crush the movement, but they underestimated the strength of a community united in its fight for justice. Mabel had built something more powerful than they could ever have anticipated. A movement grounded in the truth of the city's history, in the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. The reckoning was here, and Mabel Carter was at its center. She wasn't just fighting for the city, she was fighting for the soul of a place that had been broken by greed, by inequality, by injustice, and she was going to make sure it was never forgotten again. The city would remember Mabel Carter, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as the woman who finally made it impossible to ignore the truth. And no matter how hard they tried, they would never erase her again. The city of Fairview had always thrived on its contradictions, on the glossy surface of progress, the gleaming towers that shot up from the streets, the parks and business districts that promised a bright future for those willing to work for it. But underneath it all, beneath the polished veneer, was the real story. A story of exploitation, of inequality, and of people like Mabel Carter, who had never been given the credit they deserved for building the foundation upon which the city had been built. And now, after years of being silenced, Mabel had forced the truth to the surface. But the truth came at a cost. The backlash from the city's elite was brutal, more ruthless than Mabel had anticipated. The local government, the wealthy businessmen, and the media worked together to smear her name, to make sure that the growing movement she had sparked would be crushed before it could gather any more momentum. The threats escalated. The protests in the streets were met with violence. Families that had once supported Mabel's fight found their livelihoods destroyed, their businesses raided, their names slandered in the press. They wanted to break her. They wanted to break them all. But Mabel wasn't afraid. She had seen it all before. She had seen the system twist and turn, corrupting everything it touched. But she had also seen the strength of those who refused to give up. She had always known that the battle would be long, and that the price of victory would be high. But she wasn't willing to lose, not now, not when so many were depending on her. On the streets of Fairview, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The protests had grown larger, and so had the resistance. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds had come together in the wake of Mabel's call to action. It wasn't just the black community anymore. It was the city, in all its complexity, rising up against the very system that had kept them oppressed for generations. They were no longer just fighting for fairness. They were fighting for their history, for their place in the story of the city they had helped create. Mabel stood in the heart of the protest, the sea of faces around her filled with anger and hope, fear and determination. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their unspoken promise that they would follow her to the end, no matter what came next. She had become more than just the face of a movement. She had become the embodiment of everything that Fairview had overlooked, everything that had been brushed aside in the name of progress. But the city's elite weren't going to let her win without one last fight. Late one night, a final blow was struck. A bomb, planted in the heart of the protest's rallying point, the community centre Mabel had spent years building, exploded in a fiery blast that sent shockwaves through the city. Buildings shook, glass shattered, the streets erupted in chaos. The blast was meant to break the movement, to silence Mabel once and for all. But it had the opposite effect. Mabel was shaken but not broken. The explosion had torn apart the very heart of the community that had supported her. But it hadn't destroyed the spirit of the people. If anything, it only fueled their determination. The people didn't scatter. They didn't run in fear. Instead, they ran to the wreckage, to the smouldering remains of the centre, to pull their friends and loved ones from the debris, to rebuild what had been torn apart. They were united in their grief, in their rage, in their unwavering belief that they were worth something, that they mattered. Mabel stood among them, her face covered in ash, but her eyes burning with a fierce clarity. She knew now that there was no turning back. There was no going back to the shadows. The system had tried to break her, to erase them all. But it hadn't worked. It only made them stronger. The next morning the city was on fire, not in the literal sense, but in the hearts and minds of its people. They took to the streets in larger numbers than ever before, marching not just for justice, but for something far greater, their place in the city's history, their right to be recognized, to be seen for the hard work and sacrifices they had made for decades. The media could no longer ignore them. The elite could no longer silence them. They were everywhere now. And Mabel, she was leading them, her voice louder than ever, demanding not just justice, but the recognition that had been stolen from them. The government couldn't control the tide any longer. The people had become too powerful. The elites couldn't spin the narrative in their favor anymore. And when Mabel took the stage in front of the City Hall steps, the crowd surged forward. Every face in the crowd staring up at her with eyes full of hope. They had never looked at her this way before. They had never seen her like this. She was no longer just the woman who had been arrested for loitering. She was the force that had changed everything. As Mabel stepped to the mic, the crowd went silent, every ear attuned to the woman who had carried the weight of a city's history on her shoulders. "They tried to break us," she began, her voice steady, but filled with a deep, resolute power. "They thought they could erase us. They thought they could use violence to tear us apart. But they were wrong. They were so wrong." Her words reverberated through the crowd, and they knew. They knew the truth. This city was built on the backs of those they tried to ignore, built by the workers, the mothers, the fathers, the children who fought for a place in a world that never cared for them. We built this place, and we're not going to let them rewrite our history. We will not be erased. The crowd erupted, and for the first time, Mabel felt the weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, shift. The reckoning had come. The people had risen. They had finally been seen. But the fight wasn't over. There would still be battles ahead, battles for justice, for equality, for the rights of the most vulnerable. There would be those who tried to stop them, to push them back into the shadows. But now, Mabel knew, the people would never go back. The city had seen their power, had seen their strength, and it couldn't be unseen. Mabel turned and looked at the city around her. The buildings were no longer just symbols of wealth and power. They were a reminder of everything that had been built, everything that had been fought for, and everything that still needed to be changed. She had won, not just for herself, but for all of them. The fight was far from over, but Mabel Carter had ignited something in Fairview that could never be extinguished. The city had been forced to remember, and it would never forget again. For the first time in years, Mabel allowed herself to smile. It was a small smile, but it was enough. The storm had passed, and now it was time for the rebuilding. We'd love to hear what you think about this story. What moments stood out to you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something related to racism in your own life? Your thoughts are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each one of you. Your engagement helps us grow and continue to share stories that matter. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It really means a lot. Wishing you all a wonderful day, and if you've listened until the end, drop a comment with the phrase, "We are more than our past," so we know you're with us till the very last word. Thank you for being a part of this.